All right, so today we're going to start talking about the skeletal system, but before we do, I'm going to do a little COVID update because there's just some interesting things happening in regards to COVID. So one is that our cases continue to grow significantly here in Dunn County. So we had another record-breaking week in the week that ended yesterday. The state updates their data every day at 2 o'clock, so this is based on yesterday at 2 o'clock. So in the past week, we've now topped, I think it was like 430 some new cases just in 1 week. We also see a big spread, it's all age groups. Certainly the vast majority of infections are being diagnosed in younger folks, but there's quite a lot in these middle age groups. And for the first time now, we're starting to see significant numbers in our oldest citizens. So 11 new cases in people in their 80s, and for the first time ever, we have 6 cases in people who are 90 plus. Right, so this does not bode well for our healthcare systems because those are the folks who are statistically more likely to get severely ill and require hospitalization. So our hospitalizations, and keep in mind it takes about a week or two for many people to get sick enough that they end up needing to be in the hospital. So whenever we look at admission rates to the hospital, what we're really seeing is the effect of the cases that were diagnosed the week previously, often. Right, so this is getting to be quite a big problem here in Wisconsin, right? So here in northwestern Wisconsin, all of Mayo's hospitals are full. So there was a 72-year-old gentleman who was a retired firefighter, very beloved by the community, very well known by the community here, got severely ill, needed to be in the ICU, and they had to transport him to La Crosse because that was the closest ICU bed. And he unfortunately passed away. So we've had 2 new deaths in the last week. And so it also is not just beds, right? It's people to staff those beds, right? So it's nurses and doctors and all the people that keep a hospital running. So administrators are now having to go back to working on the floor. And actually Mayo, because Mayo, of course, has their big Rochester, Minnesota campus, but they also have a big medical center in Arizona. So just this last week, Mayo sent a whole bunch of nurses from Arizona and from Rochester, Minnesota to Eau Claire to help staff the hospital, right? Because there's just so much work to do, and a lot of the nurses and other staff are either out sick or on quarantine because there's just so much COVID around. So these are hospitalizations in the state of Wisconsin for COVID. Right, so we're seeing this huge exponential rise. We don't have enough people. We don't have enough beds for this to continue. We're already full. We're already at 100% saturation in this region and in most of the regions of the state. So it's really awesome that Mayo has these folks that are coming up from Arizona. But I looked at this data today, and it was really sobering. So this is daily case rates in different states. Every single one of the 50 states is on an exponential rise right now. The only territory that's not is the Virgin Islands. Right? So those nurses from Arizona, pretty soon they're going to be needed back in Arizona again. Right? So unlike in the spring when we had, this huge increase in cases in New York City, and we actually had nurses and doctors from here who went there to help. Or in the summer, when they had huge surges in the South, they were able to, temporary staffing agencies and such were able to send additional healthcare personnel to those regions. We're about to be in a really dangerous place where everybody needs more help, right? Nobody has any extra staff to spare. So this is where we are as a country in terms of new cases per day. So I remember when it was really big news when we hit over 20,000 a day. Now we're hitting 150, 170,000 new cases a day. Yes, we are testing more, right? So a lot of the people that we're diagnosing are people who are not as ill as the people we were diagnosing way back in the spring. But there's just a lot of disease out there, right? mine from med school, he's an infectious disease specialist at Johns Hopkins, and this is what he posted this morning on Facebook, right? So, okay, folks, it's bad. He's seeing 20, 30, and 40-year-olds hospitalized having difficulty breathing. He says the prevalence is high enough that it's not just the people with pre-existing conditions. Stay in if you can and stay safe. Wear that mask, consider eye protection. Right? It's tough to say, but reconsider Thanksgiving plans, right? Try Zoomsgiving. So what's he talking about here? So the reality is that the younger you are, the less likely you are to get severely ill from COVID. We know this. This is Wisconsin data, looking at of all the people in their 20s, right? Only 1% of them ended up needing to be hospitalized. So it's pretty good. So you might think, oh, the likelihood that I would get so sick and need to be in the hospital is really low. That's true. However, now we're seeing so many thousands and thousands and thousands of people getting sick, 6,000 to 7,000 new cases per day in Wisconsin, that 1% still amounts to a lot of people. So far in the 20 to 29 age group in Wisconsin, there have been 745 hospitalizations and 13 deaths of people in your age group. Okay? So if it's a small percentage of a very large number, it still ends up being a large number. Okay? And then this is me, right? So I'm 3 times more likely to end up in the hospital than you are. Yay. So Thanksgiving, I get it, right? As a college student myself, but consider staying put and not visiting with family. If you do go home to your parents' house, be really good before you go. No parties, no visitors, no nothing, right? You don't want to pick something up and be in your incubation phase and then get home and then get sick and give it to other people. Really limit your contact, right? You should wear a mask if you're not alone in your room, especially for the first several days. For those people who are going home at Thanksgiving and stay home, which some people are, not everybody, a lot of people are planning to come back, right? But for that first week or two, don't have people other than your immediate family over. This is not the Thanksgiving to have Aunt Betty and Uncle George and Grandma Mildred over, right? It's just too risky. And when I went home for Thanksgiving, right, I'd always get together with my old friends. We'd go out to the bars, hang out at each other's house, all that kind of stuff. That's exactly what we're going to be asking you not to do, right? The more people get together indoors in unmasked settings, like when they're eating or drinking, the more this spreads. And right now, it's everywhere. So unless you've already recently had it and are in your kind of immune period of 90 days, you have to assume that you could have it and not know it. Right? You don't want to be the reason that somebody you love ends up in the hospital, right? And I hope we have hospital beds available in a week or two. All right, that's doom and gloom, but such it is. We're in for a really difficult next few months. It's probably going to get really bad unless we do a complete lockdown, which nobody is probably willing to do. Yeah.
What about people that are already
Right, so if you're in your 90-day period after being confirmed positive, you are considered immune. We have really good data that shows that you probably can't get it again and you probably can't spread it to other people. So there's kind of a silver lining there. So you can visit grandma. Yeah? Other questions about COVID before we move on? Vaccine update, so Moderna's, which is the other mRNA vaccine. So last week, Pfizer came out with a press release that their vaccine looked more than 90% effective. Moderna, not to be outdone, just came out with a press release yesterday saying theirs looks like it's more than 94% effective. I'm actually kind of more excited about the Moderna vaccine because it can be stored in regular refrigerators in a clinic for up to 30 days, as opposed to the Pfizer vaccine, which requires special ultra-cold freezers. So I think from a logistics standpoint, that vaccine is more likely to be useful in terms of operationally how we can actually get people vaccinated. We have to keep in mind, however, that last week's announcement and this week's announcement, these are press releases. This is not a scientific publication. They have not released their data. This is just an early, hey, so far, it looks like maybe it's really good. Okay? We don't have their data yet. Right? It's really encouraging, and I'm so excited about it because a vaccine, right? So we've had 11 million people now in the United States diagnosed with COVID. That's 3% of our overall population. In order to get to the point of herd immunity, where the virus stops being able to circulate, we need 70% to be immune, right? So just getting us to 3% and our hospitals are already full. So if this keeps growing, there's no way we're going to get to 70% without massive failure of our healthcare system, which means then people die from car accidents and appendicitis and heart attacks and strokes and other things because we don't have the resources to treat them.
How long does it take typically for like an actual scientific study or peer-reviewed study to be released?
Right. So how long does it take for a typical scientific study to be released? Usually, actually, it takes a period of about a year. So usually the scientists write up their data, they submit it to a journal, the journal then submits it to outside reviewers who look through it. They say, no, I think this is off a little bit here, or could you explain this better here? I really need to see your data there. Right? This is called the peer review process. And then the original authors get that feedback, they make adjustments, they make changes, right? Then it goes back to the reviewers again, and it's usually at least 3 different independent reviewers. And if they say, yep, this looks valid, this looks right, then it gets published. In the age of COVID, we've been trying to get stuff out more quickly. So there's a lot of what's called preprints coming out. So that is things that have been submitted to a journal. The journal thinks it probably has merit, but it hasn't yet been peer reviewed. So in the interest of trying to do something about this pandemic, preprints have been released publicly, which usually doesn't happen. Right? And so we know that early on, for example, some of the data on hydroxychloroquine looked really promising, hadn't been peer reviewed, and then when they looked at it, they were like, oh, wait. So it's prone to more error, right? But the trade-off is to try to get the information out quickly because maybe it'll help save lives. Vaccine development usually takes 10 years. So this is a massively ramped up pace. Yes? Yeah, that's a really good question. So how can we treat the disease better? Right? Is that the question? Like, what kind of treatments do we have? So unfortunately, we haven't found many things that actually do much good at all. We have found a very small benefit with using hydrocortisone, which is a steroid, or dexamethasone, which is a steroid, in severely ill people. We also find a very small benefit in remdesivir, which is an antiviral drug given to people. The antibody cocktails are still under investigation, so we'll see. We don't really know yet if they're working. We're trying to see, because theoretically they should help, but we don't have data yet. For people who aren't hospitalized or aren't severely ill, so far nothing has been shown to be effective. Yes, ma'am? Right, so your immune system does fight, in most people, right, your immune system does successfully fight this off, right? Most people recover, right? Most people get better. Most people with strep throat, even if we don't treat with the antibiotics, you will get better. Your immune system will take care of it. It just takes longer, right? And you might get sicker. So when we're looking for a treatment for infectious diseases, right, we're trying to help your body, right? And so I know people are interested in vitamin D. So far, we don't really have any evidence to suggest that. It's really kind of a complex question, right? People looked at hydroxychloroquine in mildly ill people. It made no difference, didn't help them get better sooner. Ibuprofen, which you mentioned, helps treat your symptoms. So you might remember when we talked about pain or nociception, that prostaglandin is a chemical released by damaged cells. And the nociceptors are chemical receptors that sense the presence of that molecule and send a signal up to your brain that is interpreted as pain. Prostaglandins are also involved in fever and body aches. So taking a medicine like ibuprofen, Advil, Motrin, which interferes with the production of prostaglandins, helps you feel better, right? It treats your symptoms, which is great. You don't need to be terribly, terribly miserable, right? But it doesn't actually help you get better any faster, right? So there's a lot of interest in how can we help your own body, your own immune system to fight this off better. And there's no shortage of alternative health websites out there that'll tell you to take vitamin D or vitamin C or drink green tea or whatever. None of those have really been shown to make a difference. Do they hurt? Probably not, most of them, right? But none of them have actually really been shown.
I was actually just going to ask why people take vitamin C if they think they're going to get sick.
Yeah. Yeah, vitamin C for a while, there was this guy, Linus Pauling, who won a Nobel Prize for something else, and he was like, vitamin C, you fix everything, and everybody was like, yeah, take tons of vitamin C, and it hasn't actually, when they study it, it just doesn't really seem to do much, but...
The only thing it blocks is scurvy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what about like some
Right, so why are some people asymptomatic with COVID and other people get really sick? Really good question. We don't totally know. Yeah. So part of it seems to be the dose that you got, right? So how many germs actually got to you? And we know this because of the cruise ship stories. So there were multiple outbreaks that happened on cruise ships. Some of the ones that happened early in the pandemic, before we really understood anything at all about what was going on, lots of those passengers got really, really sick. Later on, when people were still on cruise ships, which is like, but anyway, right? Where as soon as they started realizing that they had some cases, they had everybody wear masks. Not only were there fewer cases overall, showing that masks helped reduce transmission, but also the people who did get sick did not get as sick, right? So if you almost think about the virus as almost like a poison, right? If you get just a little dose, you might just not feel very sick at all, right? Or just mildly ill. But if you get a bigger dose, you can get more severely ill. So that's part of it. Dose seems to be part of it. But then there also just seems to be variation from person to person for reasons that we're not sure why. There was a new discovery in this last week saying that it looks like part of why COVID makes some people so sick is because it interferes with a part of their immune system called interferons. And there might be genetic differences among people in terms of how that interacts with their immune system. So they're trying to figure out why some people, aside from the dose question, why some people get so sick and other people don't. Because obviously, if we could figure out what the difference is and make sure that we get everybody, whatever it is that you need to get not super sick, we would love to be able to do that. Other questions? All right, let's learn about our meat cage. All right, so Tuesday, the day you realize that nothing can stop you because you are a magic skeleton packed with meat and animated with electricity and imagination. You have a cave in your face full of sharp bones, and you have 5 tentacles at the end of each arm. You are a magic skeleton. You can do anything. Right? I love this quote. Right? So we're just kind of meat skeletons with squishy butts inside. Love this one. You're a ghost driving a meat-coated skeleton made from stardust, as we all are, right? All of our atoms originally came from the galaxy, riding a rock hurtling through space. Fear nothing. Except COVID, right? Okay. So we don't fear, let's just respect it. Okay. Bad news. All right. So when you look at the human body, we really are a meat skeleton with squishy bits inside. Right, so my lung, my heart, all my digestive organs, reproductive organs are all inside this layer of meat, right? So meat is muscle. When you eat meat, you are eating muscle, unless you're eating organ meats, that's different, obviously, right? So, and then of course we have a squishy bit inside our skull as well. This is another MRI image. They just kind of color-coded it, right? So we have all this muscle and bone, and inside this hollow space like almost like a Russian nesting doll, are all our squishy bits. And then the outer surface of us is covered with a layer of leather, basically. Right? So you can think about human bodies as we're squishy bits inside a meat cage, right, or a meat skeleton, then with a covering around the top. And so we've talked about all of these systems with the exception of these two, which are coming up next. We're going to talk about these this week. We've already talked about skin. And it's really neat because when you look at how the human body forms in utero, when you're a little tiny embryo, when you go from a fertilized egg, what we do is our cells form one group of cells that's going to become the squishy bits, one group of cells that's going to be the meat skeleton, and another group of cells that's going to be the skin. That's like one of the first things we do is like they decide which team they're going to play on. All right. Let's talk about the bone part of the meat cage. Skeletal system, our skeletons and all of its associated structures. So what do bones do for us? Let's just kind of think a little bit about the functions that the skeletal system is going to do for us. Yeah, Paul? Provide structure, right? So that I'm not just a big heap of muscle, jiggling about on the floor, right? So it gives me structure. Good. What else? Dan? Yeah, absolutely. It's going to protect those squishy bits, right? That's why you have a skull. Pretty darn important, right? To protect that brain. Good. So we've got structure, we've got protection. What else does our skeleton do for us? Yeah. Bone marrow. So we have two different types of bone marrow. We have red bone marrow, which actually makes our blood cells. Our blood cells are made in our red bone marrow. And we also have yellow marrow, which is a place where we store fat inside of our bones. It was like, oh, here's like a little pantry. Let me just store some fat in there. Anything else that you can think of?
Calcium?
Yes. So bone is also our big reservoir storage system for calcium. Calcium levels are really important for homeostasis. And so we use our bones like a calcium sink. If we have extra calcium around, we put it in the bones. If we need some more calcium, we pull it out of the bones. It's like our savings account for calcium, which is pretty darn cool. Anything else? I think we got most of them. The only one that you didn't kind of say specifically is movement, right? But that's kind of in combination with this support and structure function. I think a lot of people kind of assume, right, that not only does it give us our structure, but it also allows us to move around, right? So without my bones, I would not be able to walk like this. I would just have to like ooze or slither or something. I don't know. All right, so we've got this support or structure, movement, protection of your squishy bits, and then we store lots of things in our bones. So calcium we talked about. Phosphate is another salt that we store in our bones. And I mentioned the fat with the yellow marrow. And then we produce blood cells in the red bone marrow. So our bones are actually doing a lot of things for us that we don't always give them credit for. All right. So let's kind of get down to the nitty-gritty of it. There's two basic types of bone tissue, compact and spongy bone. So we'll talk about them one in turn. So compact bone, this is what you saw when we learned about bone in the beginning of the semester when we learned about different tissue types. Remember, so bone is a connective tissue. As such, it has specialized cells and an extracellular matrix. Bone has this very highly organized structure, compact bone does. It's very strong and it's very dense. So if we take a closer look at this organizational structure of compact bone, we've got a bunch of parts to learn. So one is these circular structures that look like bunches of tree rings. Each one of these circular units with all these rings inside of it is called an osteon, O-S-T-E-O-N, right? So that's like this tree trunk that's been cut, and it has all these little circles inside. So if we look at an individual osteon, the different parts that we're going to see are as follows. In the middle, there's a central, or sometimes called reversion canal. In your book, it calls it a central canal, but some of these diagrams call it the other. So that's going to be in the very center. And that's important because that's where we're going to find the blood vessels and the nerves, right? So all tissues need blood supply, right? They need blood coming to them in order to deliver what two main important things? What do all cells need to survive in order to make ATP? What are the two ingredients, huh? Oxygen and glucose, right? So they're going to bring oxygen and glucose to the cells. The cells have fuel, right? So they can make ATP as their fuel. And of course, carry carbon dioxide away. The blood is also bringing whatever other nutrients or building blocks the bone cells are going to need to do their job. So in that central or reversion canal, we find the blood vessels and the nerves. Then we have these concentric rings, and they're called lamellae. Because if something is lamellated, it means it just has all these concentric layers to it. So they're called lamellae, those are those rings. And then staggered throughout little spaces in between those lamellae, we have cells, osteocytes. So cyte, C-Y-T-E, means cell. Osteo means bone. So it tells you what it is. It's an osteocyte, a bone cell. And those are the cells that are going to be responsible for maintaining. So just kind of general servicing, maintaining of bone. And then in order for these cells out here to actually get the nutrients that are coming from the blood vessels, there are these little tiny channels or canals called canaliculi. Okay, so that they can actually, because these rings are made of hard bone. Okay, so you need to have these little canals so that you can get those nutrients and gas exchange. Questions about this bit? Kind of a really interesting structure, right? So much like a tree, right? This is really strong. This is really solid. All these concentric rings of really hard material. Okay. The other type of bone is called spongy bone. And looking at this image, you can see why. It kind of looks like a sponge. So instead of being totally dense and solid, except for those central canals, the way spongy bone works is you have all these little trabeculae, is what they're called. A trabecula is like a branch-like thing sticking out. It's like a girder, a strut going from one thing to another. Right? As you can imagine, this is really structurally quite strong. Right? So let's see. Right? So ignore this ladder, right? So this right here, this diagonal piece, that's a strut, right? Making this structure stronger. So spongy bone is made of all these trabeculae going in all these different directions, which gives you strength in multiple directions while being lightweight. So that's kind of really cool. All right, so that's spongy bone. So how do these two types of bones come together to kind of form what we know of as bone? So imagine a long bone, so kind of imagine your typical bone, such as your humerus, which is the bone in your upper arm, or your femur, which is the bone in your thigh. And it has a couple different parts. So the word epiphysis, not epiphany, epiphysis, refers to the ends of that bone. Right? So here's the epiphysis up here. That's the end of the bone. Inside the end of the bone, we find spongy bone. And the interesting thing, the reason why we do, is because the ends of our bones have to be able to withstand impact coming from lots of different directions. Okay? So, the bone in the top of my femur, right now, the top of that bone, the very superior surface of it, is getting a lot of pressure, right? All my body weight is sitting on it, so it has to be strong. If I go like this, Now that bone is at 90 degrees, so now the force is coming this way, right? So if you're at the end of a bone and you are in a joint that moves so that the bone is at different angles relative to the joint, you have to make sure that you can withstand forces coming this way as well as forces coming right this way, which is what happens when my leg goes down. So that's why we find spongy bone at the epiphyses, or the ends of the bones, because they're in the joints. Those spaces are the perfect nooks and crannies for red bone marrow. And the red bone marrow is what makes our blood cells. Both our red blood cells are erythrocytes and our white blood cells are leukocytes. Pretty handy. We were like, hey, we got some extra space here. Let's just stick some stuff in there and make use of it. All right, so that's the epiphysis. This is what it looks like, right? This is an actual bone. I was going to bring one today, but I was like, I didn't know how well you would be able to see it, right? So you can see all that spongy bone, right? So if force is coming this way, we've got good girders that way. If force is coming this way, it doesn't matter. Multi-directional strength. Very important. The other part of the bone is the shaft, the long part, and that's called the diaphysis. Now the diaphysis is actually hollow. It's actually a tube. The outside part of it, the walls of the tube, are made of compact bone. So it's going to be really strong in one direction, in that axial direction. Okay? It's going to be really strong this way. If I come at a bone this way, in the diaphysis, it's liable to break. It's not really made for that. Right? So if you've ever broken your bone, usually, oftentimes, most frequently, it's through the diaphysis and it's this way. All right. So inside that tube, that opening inside the tube is called the medullary cavity. And that is filled with yellow bone marrow. And yellow bone marrow is yellow because it's just fat. Right? So that's a place for our bodies to store extra fat. So not only do we store it underneath our skin and around some of our inner organs and squishy bits, we also put fat in the medullary canal, in the hollow tube inside the shafts of our bones. Yeah?
Does the body tend to store fat, I guess, under the skin first or in the bones first?
In the bones first. Right. So you're going to keep it in here as long as you can. It's going to be the last one to go. All right. One more piece of the, oh yeah, I wanted to show you this. So this is obviously a fracture of a bone. This is actually somebody's humerus, the bone in the arm here. They don't think it's very funny. Oh, it's such a bad joke. But the reason why I picked this image is because you can clearly see that the diaphysis, the shaft of the bone, is a hollow tube, right? You can see how it's darker in the center because it's just filled with adipose tissue or fat. And adipose tissue looks clear or black on an x-ray. Right? We're going to talk about fractures later today. Okay. All right, the final part that I wanted to tell you about is there's a membrane that covers the entire surface of the bone, and that's called the periosteum. Peri, P-E-R-I, as a prefix, means around the surface of, like perimeter, right? Around the outside of. Osteum for bone. So this is a thin but really tough membrane, which is going to be important, and it also has a lot of nerve endings and blood vessels in it. So the periosteum is why, of all the parts on your body that you can bang, one of the things that's the most painful to bang up against something is your shin. Because if you feel your shin, go ahead and just like reach down and feel your shin. You're feeling your bone right here. That's your tibia, right? So the only thing that's between the periosteum, which has a lot of nerve endings, and whatever you're bonking your shin on, is just a thin layer of skin, right? That's why that hurts so much. It's right on your periosteum, practically. Okay. So we have the epiphysis, the diaphysis. This is spongy bone. This is compact bone with a hole in the middle for the yellow marrow. And then it's all covered with a membrane called the periosteum. This is just another image that I thought was kind of nice. So one of the really interesting things about bone is we tend to think of it because it's hard, we tend to think of it as static and unchanging. But actually, our bone is living tissue. And as such, it's constantly remodeling itself, right? It's like, you know, my parents with the house, like, oh, now we're redoing the kitchen. Oh, now we're doing the bedroom, right? It's constantly remodeling. We are constantly building new bone and tearing down old bone all the time. And in fact, your skeleton is entirely brand new every 7 years, right? But it's not like you do it all at once. It's not like you molt like a snake or something, right? It's this continual process, right? But all the cells and molecules that are in my skeleton right now, they won't be there 7 years from now. It is a living organ. Okay? So, how do we do that? Well, we have 3 different types of cells in bone. Okay? 3 different types of cells. The first cell is the osteoblast. So that's these guys here in this diagram. Blast has a B, so think of Bob the Builder. Osteoblasts, their job is to build bone. They do that by laying down calcium in a specific pattern. Okay? So osteoblasts build bone. So they're going to be the builders. But then, of course, we have to be constantly doing demo as well. So then we have osteoclasts. And I think of clasts as like they cut down the bone, right? They chew away the bone. So that one has a C, osteoclasts. Something is clastic, it means it tears stuff down. So osteoclasts are taking down old bone, osteoblasts are building new bone, and then we have the cells we've already learned the names of, the osteocytes that live in the bone and do general routine maintenance. Because again, this is living tissue. It happens to be rock hard, but it is living tissue nonetheless. All right? So we have these 3 cell types that do these very different jobs for us. Osteoblasts build bone, osteoclasts chew it away, and osteocytes are just your normal routine bone cells that are doing routine maintenance. All right. So we're going to watch a little, maybe not. Collagen supplement will improve your body's ability to produce collagen is maybe, right? But only in that it gives you the precise amino acid combination that you need for ingredients to make new collagen, right? But you break it down before you absorb it. Yeah? So as long as you're eating enough protein and enough varied protein so that you're getting enough of the different amino acids that you need, then usually there's no significant benefit to taking a collagen supplement, right? But if you just want to make sure to target like just exactly all the ingredients that I need for making collagen, then sure, you can take a collagen supplement. Yep, good question. Other questions? All right. How does bone grow? How did you get your skeleton? Well, it didn't start off as bone. It started off as cartilage. So what happens is first you make a rough draft. You make a cartilage model of all your bones. What we're looking at here is a rat embryo. Notice the tail, right? So this is a rat embryo. And everything that's blue is cartilage. And then the dark purple stuff is actual bone. So here's its thigh bone, also called the femur. We actually are anatomically very similar to rats and cats and dogs and all kinds of mammals. We even have bones that have the same names and arrangements. But you can see at this point in its development, only the middle part of the femur has actually turned to bone. This is still cartilage, this is still cartilage. So we start off with cartilage, and then our osteoblasts start laying down bone on that cartilage model, right? So turning from that squishy cartilage, bouncy cartilage, into actual hard bone. So what this looks like, so by the time human infants are born, we've already laid down a lot of bone, but not all of it. So this image here is the hand of an infant. Can anybody guess why they took an x-ray of that baby's hand? We usually don't x-ray a baby's hand. Dustin? It's got a 6th finger. So that's called polydactyly, right? Six-fingered man, right? So my name is Inigo Montoya, but right, so some people are born with a 6th finger, right? It just kind of happens sometimes. In this day and age, we surgically remove them just to make life easier for them because it'd be really hard to find gloves and people would look at you funny and all those types of things. They don't tend to be highly functional 6th fingers also, so it's not like, oh gosh, I could have been a concert pianist. They tend to not actually be hooked up to much in the way of muscles or tendons, so you can't really do anything with them. So that's why this baby got an x-ray to begin with. Usually we don't subject infants to radiation. But what you can see is these are the bones in the middle of the hand, which are bones here. They look like finger bones, but they're not. They're actually in this part of your hand. And you can see they don't extend the full length of the hand. There's all this space in between one bone and another. But in your hand, there's no space in between your bones. It's bone to bone to bone. You can also see in the wrist, there's like maybe 1, maybe 2 little bones here. The others are there. They're just cartilage models. So this second image is a toddler, as it tells you. And we can see that more of the bone is now bone, right, and less cartilage, because cartilage doesn't show up on the x-ray. We see we clearly have 2 bony bones here. The rest are still cartilage, right? We're getting some more development. We're laying down more bone tissue on top of that cartilage. And then the third image here is not an adult. It's a teenager. And again, we can see now more of the bones have ossified or actually become true bones. But there are still spots where the bone has not yet been laid down. So this right here is one bone. But you can see this black line here. There's still some cartilage left in that bone that hasn't been ossified yet. We haven't yet laid down calcium. You can see that this is one bone, and again, we still have these kind of black lines going across, right? Black line towards the end of the bones. If we look at an adult hand, there are no black lines except for the spaces in between bones, right? So this is a normal adult hand. These are the bones in the hand itself, finger bones, 1, 2, 3, right? 1, 2, 3. 3 separate bones. Except for the thumb, 2. So, what was that black line? That is the last place that you turn from cartilage into bone. That is your growth plate. Okay? If we turned all the bones, 100% of the bone, into bone right away, then you would be stuck, you would be locked in. You could not grow. Okay? So we need to leave a part as cartilage where we can kind of expand it and then turn some of it into bone. Grow it and turn some of it into bone. Grow it and turn some of it into bone. So it's kind of like, so if there was a line of cartilage in between these 2 papers, the way a bone grows is like this. Not from the end, right? But from the spot just off the end. That's how it's going to grow. It's pretty darn cool. All right. So once it's closed, you are done. Your bone cannot lengthen anymore. You are done growing. So if you ever had an x-ray as a teenager, perhaps, and the doctor said to your parents, oh, still got a few years of growing yet, or, oh, looks like they're done growing, that's what they're looking at. They're looking at this growth plate. All this pink tissue is bone, right, because they stained it to look pink. This purple here is hyaline cartilage. That's the growth plate. That's that black line that we were seeing on the x-ray. So I can build new bone on this side. I can build new bone on this side that's going to make the bone lengthen. Yeah?
What determines, I guess, how tall a person is going to be besides genetics?
So what determines how tall a person is going to be besides genetics? Most of it is genetics, especially in this country. Right? Why? Like, how is that controlled? It has to do with something called growth hormone and how much your body tends to make. That ends up being basically what determines how tall you are. The other is nutrition. So if someone doesn't get enough nutrition, their growth will be stunted and they will end up shorter. But most of it's genetic. Unless you have a bone condition, right? There's a few conditions that impact bones. Yeah.
What about carpal tunnel syndrome?
Ooh, so carpal tunnel syndrome is entirely different. I will talk about it on Thursday. Okay? It is related to bone, but it's not really something that has to do with bone. I'll show you. I'll show you on Thursday. Good question. All right. So on an X-ray, this is somebody who's probably a teenager. Here's the growth plate. This is cartilage. That's why it looks black on the X-ray. Right? This is one bone. This is the fibula. This is the side bone in your shin. This is your tibia. This is your shin bone. This is their ankle. Right? This is the foot down here. So you see that black line. And look, this is their heel bone. Black line. Don't buy them a pair of really expensive shoes yet. They're still growing. Okay? They're not done growing yet. Okay. Right? So this is where those growth plates are located. Right? So you can see how they kind of line up. You can see there's that one down here. Right? But so we have these in all of our what we call long bones, which are kind of bones that you think of. Bones that are shaped differently grow slightly differently, and that's kind of beyond the purview of this course. Okay. So again, here's that teenager, open growth plate, not done growing yet. Here's an adult ankle. Right? I don't have a black line anymore. So if you take a picture of my ankle, now it might look like that. I don't know. Right? You can kind of almost see where it used to be, but it's not black anymore. There's no cartilage there anymore. It's all bone. Done growing, game over. All right. So that's how bones grow. Now we're going to shift into talking about bone remodeling, which is the concept I already introduced, right? So our bone is a living tissue. It's constantly building up new bones, tearing down old bone all the time. It is alive, okay? Why do we do that? Well, this is the same thing that I said before, right? So the blasts are building, the clasts are tearing it down. Why do we do that? Any ideas?
Possibly for growth, but then also when you break a bone.
Yeah, so healing and repair, yes, right? Growth, no, right? Not so much, a little bit, mostly building, right? A little bit of tearing down when we have to make the center of the tube bigger as the bone grows. One of the main reasons that we do this is because of that calcium storage function, right? So if we need to adjust our calcium levels, right, if my blood calcium is a little low, I need to free up some extra calcium from the reserves, I'm going to chew away some extra bone. If I have a lot of calcium around, well, I might store some of it by packing on some extra bone in a place. You mostly do the former. You mostly just chew away bone when you need calcium. Okay? So that's going to be a really important part of this. And the other part, aside from what Paula said about healing, which I should have put on the slide, my bad, is to allow us to adapt to mechanical stress. So in our bodies, right, we adapt to new conditions and to new stresses. So if I start asking my bones to do more work and to withstand higher loads, right, like if I start a running program, or if I start doing weightlifting and then doing squats with a big weight on my shoulders, right, and all of a sudden my bones have to support more weight than they usually do, right? I need to be able to adapt to that. So my bone will strengthen in response to increased loads, right? So when you see these like, oh, exercises for bone strength and these senior exercise programs called Strong Bones, absolutely, right? So weight-bearing exercises, so when people exercise, it's not just for their muscles. It's not just for their cardiovascular fitness. It's also for their bone health, right? So this is why astronauts right? If you go up and you live on the space station, they have to do a lot of special exercises so they don't lose tons of bone density. Right? So in the early days, they would have these treadmills that they would run on, and they would wear a belt that had like this elastic thing that was pulling them down against the treadmill to try to simulate gravity. So they would still get that pounding with every step, right? Because that mechanical stress is what's going to stimulate those trabeculae in the spongy bone to build and get stronger, right? Because like many things, just like muscle, it's use it or lose it. So if you don't engage in much weight-bearing exercise, you will have less strong bones than someone who does. And you will be at higher risk of fractures compared with someone who exercises regularly. Right, so there's lots of reasons to exercise. Strong bones is one of them. Okay. So it's really important to realize, however, so let's say I was like, I know, I'm going to run a marathon, which is like the biggest joke ever. But let's say I decided I want to run a marathon. I said, okay, this week I'm going to run 2 miles today, and I'm going to run 3 miles 2 days from today, and I'm going to run 5 miles, within a week, and then I'm going to run 10, and then I'm going to run 20, right? And I ramped up really quickly because I was like, oh, I'm going to run a New York Marathon in 2 weeks or whatever. It's not happening this year anyway, right? If you do too much too fast, you don't give your bone enough time to get strong enough quickly enough. So this process takes about 3 weeks. So if I try to push it, if I try to rapidly increase either how much weight, right, or how much distance, how much pounding I'm asking my bones to take, right, what's going to happen? If I start demanding of it more than it's strong enough to withstand, yeah. It's going to break, absolutely. This is what a stress fracture is, okay? So a stress fracture is when you're exposing the bone to more mechanical force than it can adapt to. Either because you're doing too much too quickly, or you're just doing too much and it's kind of beyond the capacity of the bone to actually get strong enough to withstand. So what we're seeing here is actually the bones in somebody's foot called the metatarsals, which are one of the most common bones for a stress fracture. And so we see this little tiny line here, right? So just think of it like if you see a bridge or something and some of the struts start to weaken with time. It's just not strong enough for the load, right? It's going to start to crack. Yeah.
Is this more common in people who wear heels?
Is this more common in people who wear high heels? No, they get other problems. This is just not kind of normal. Our feet really weren't adapted to be walking around like this, right? We're adapted to be walking around like that. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So that's why rest periods are really important, and that's why making sure that you don't do too much too quickly is also really important. So what's interesting is that our cardiovascular system, our aerobic fitness, the ability of our muscles and our lungs and our heart to adapt to increased workload, they can adapt much more quickly than our bones, right? So you may feel like, oh, I can run farther. I've still got another mile in me. Well, maybe your muscles and your heart and your lungs do, but your bones may not. All right, so that's why rest periods are important. So for recovery and healing and strengthening and shoring up of bone in between, right, like a high mileage run, and doing a gradual increase in your exercise. Yeah.
Also, my friend says, like after running or something, you get milk back in and banana.
Yeah, so the issue of what kinds of things to eat right after a workout. So you're saying coach says milk and a banana. So milk is actually like, and especially chocolate milk is actually one of the perfect post-workout foods, just in terms of the composition of fats, carbohydrates, and proteins that it has, and the particular amino acids and minerals that you'll find in it. So some friends of mine who do sports medicine, they have all their athletes drink chocolate milk after their workouts. It sounds absolutely delicious to me.
In high school, we had like some workouts, and then our coach would bring chocolate milk and bananas.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So, so when we look at how many runners, for example, get stress fractures, right, it's the long distance runners. So if you run more than 10K a week, your risk of a stress fracture is more than 40%, right? There's kind of only so much that the human body can take, especially if you ramp up quickly over a short period of time. We also see stress fractures more often in people who have eating disorders in general because they have either lower nutrient availability in terms of calcium and proteins and all the other things you need for healthy bone, but also because energetically they're usually running at a deficit. So usually their body is trying to conserve resources. When you're in kind of a semi-starvation mode, one of the parts of your body is that your body's going to start neglecting and saying, well, I'll get around to that later. It's low priority right now. It's actually your bones. Also your reproductive system. So those are like, So, all right. So now we have a fracture. How are we going to heal it, right? So what is this process? So raise your hand if you've ever broken a bone. Not too many of you. A few, yeah, a few, maybe, yeah. I know. I was like in my 30s before I broke a bone. It was pretty amazing. All right. So how does it heal? There's 4 steps. Okay. So we're gonna break it down. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 steps of bone healing. First one, something called a hematoma. A hematoma, that just means heme, like the molecule that's in red blood cells. It just means there's a whole bunch of blood. Right? So a hematoma is a pool of blood. So here's my break in the bone, and it bleeds inside the bone. Now what you can see here is that the periosteum, that membrane, is still intact. Right? You see that little membrane around the outside of the bone? It's still intact. And so the blood is kind of pushing it out. Right? You have this bubble, this lake of blood underneath there. And so it's really interesting because sometimes if somebody breaks a bone, but it's not displaced, right? It's just a crack through the bone, it can be really hard to see on an x-ray initially. So sometimes we know that there's a fracture there because what we see is this periosteum, that membrane, being lifted up from underneath by that pool of blood. So in this x-ray here, this is the fracture. It's very tough to see, little tiny crack, right? Here's normal compact bone with a periosteum on top of it, and then look. See how the periosteum is kind of swollen and pushed out? That's because there's blood under here. So that's one of the things that we look for when we look at an x-ray to see if there's a fracture, right? Because if you rip a piece of paper, but then you put the 2 halves together right back where they were, it can be really hard to see that. So sometimes that periosteal elevation, right, that's caused by that hematoma underneath is the only thing that we can actually see on initial x-ray. So our first step is the hematoma. It occurs pretty quickly after the fracture. Makes sense. The second step is, because it takes so long to lay down bone, right? Making actual bone is time consuming. So in the interim, we're going to create this thing called a fibrocartilage callus. So if we break that down, fibro, it's going to be fibrous. It's going to have collagen fibers in it. Cartilage, it's also going to have cartilage in it, right? Callus means like a scab, right? Something to just patch things together and hold them together. So this is a temporary stopgap measure. It's not particularly strong, but it's something that our body is able to build relatively quickly. So we're going to make this fibrocartilage callus, and so it's purple here. They're trying to show you that cartilage. Okay? And we're starting to grow new blood vessels, right? So here's a pretty bad break of somebody's humerus. You might be like, why did they leave it like those 2 ends not close together? And the reason is this is a child, and those bones are going to grow back together just fine without needing surgery. It's pretty amazing. But you can kind of see, right? Imagine this is like a big scab. Just like how a scab holds the edges of your wound on your skin together, right? This is holding the ends of the bone together. So this fibrocartilage callus is going to help hold the bone together, give it a little bit of stability, right, for kind of the first several weeks before we have the opportunity to actually lay down real bone. So this is step 2. Step 3, as you might imagine, we're going to start to lay down bone, right? So on top of that fibrocartilage callus, so again, we kind of made a cartilage model, the osteoblasts are going to move in and lay down bone. And they're going to be willy-nilly about it, right? They're just going to lay down a whole bunch of bone around this whole thing, right? So you can see this big bump on this bone. This is a bony callus, right? We're not done yet. The bone doesn't look perfectly healed yet, right? So now we have a scab that's made of hard bone, basically. So this is going to be much, much stronger. It just takes a little longer to put in place. So this is step 3. And then finally, we're going to do remodeling, okay? So what's going to happen then is the osteoclasts are going to go in and chew away the extra bony callus, right? Chew away the extra bone that we don't need. So we're going to pare the bone down to its normal shape. So if you've ever spackled over a hole in a wall, right? In the beginning you slap a bunch of spackle on, right? And then you smooth it a little bit, but then there's still a lot of extra. So then you go in and you sand it down to get rid of the extra and make it smooth. That's what this 4th step of remodeling is like, right? We had that bony callus, it was this big knob around the bone. Now we're going to get rid of that extra bone and just have a nice, beautiful, healed bone. I don't have a picture here because it's like looks like a normal bone now, which is pretty cool. All right, so step 1, hematoma, it bleeds and it may lift the periosteum, bulge out the periosteum here. Step 2, fibrocartilage callus. Step 3, bony callus. And then we remodel it to get the bone back to its normal shape. So here's another picture of a fracture. And then this is a bony callus because it's showing up well on x-ray. So you can see this is 6 weeks later. It takes time for this to happen. I love this. So this is another infant, and this is their humerus. It's actually not terribly uncommon for the humerus to be broken in infants. And you might say, oh my gosh, this is child abuse. It could be, but actually, oftentimes the humerus gets broken as they're trying to get the baby dressed. Right? Getting their little arms through their sleeves and stuff like that. This can happen just from that sometimes. Yep. Good question. So is there a difference in bone strength after a previous fracture? If it heals well, it's just as good as new. It's pretty amazing. But it takes time, right? So it takes 4 to 8 weeks at least for healing to occur, and up to 12 months to get back to normal strength, right? It takes time. So as we can see, right, so here's the initial fracture. It got a little bit more displaced. Here's that fibrocartilage callus. Here's the bony callus, right? And then this is at 6 months. So you would never know, actually, looking at that x-ray, that that bone had ever been broken.
So one of the previous lectures, there was like a bad fracture of humerus as a child, and I noticed there was like a little bone shard. Do those just get eaten up by the osteoclasts?
Clasps, yes, absolutely. It's pretty cool. It's like, how do they know? How do they know what shape this is supposed to be? I don't know, but they do. It's really cool. In part, they know the shape it's supposed to be because of how the forces are distributed along it. All right. So why do we put people in a cast? So you want to immobilize the bone because that fibrocartilage callus is not very strong, right? And so you don't want it to get ripped by the bone being moved. right? You want to hold the ends of the bone together and still as much as you can, right? So it's like if ever you had a scab as a kid and you kept picking at it and your parents were like, stop picking at it, right? Because then it can just open up again. We don't want that to happen, right? So that's what casts are for. It's to keep the bone immobilized. Sometimes when it's a really bad fracture, they won't rely on just a cast to immobilize it. They'll actually go in and do surgery and put plates and screws in the bone to hold it in position. Okay. Oh, we're going to end today by just talking briefly about joints, not that kind of joint, bone joints. Right? So a joint is any place that two or more bones come together. Technically, that is what a joint is. You have two or more bones coming together. Now, we tend to think of those as places where we can move, and many joints do allow for movement, but not all of them. So, for example, our skull is actually made up of multiple different separate bones, but they do not move, with the exception of this one, right? Your jawbone, your mandible. They don't move, but these are all joints, okay? This is a joint in the front of the pelvis here. It does not normally move, okay? Your sacroiliac joint in the back does not normally move, right? But it's a place where two or more bones come together. But we're going to focus on the joints that do move because they're more interesting. So most of our joints that result in motion are what are called synovial joints. That's kind of the category there, synovial joints. And synovial joints have several features that allow for easy movement. So first of all, the ends of the bones are covered with hyaline cartilage. Okay? So that tissue that we learned about way back in the beginning of the semester, glassy ground substance, chondrocytes and lacunae. And that is nice and smooth and slippery and a little bit springy. Right? So it gives us a frictionless surface as well as a little bit of shock absorption in our joints where those two bones come together. So that's really nice. In this space around where the two ends of the bones meet, we have fluid, right? It's like lubricating fluid in an engine, and it's called synovial fluid, right? And that helps keep everything nice and slippery and smooth and frictionless. The way we actually move a bone is by pulling on it with a muscle. So here's a muscle attached to this bone up here, and then it has a tendon. And so a tendon is a piece of connective tissue that attaches a muscle to a bone. Okay? We also have ligaments, and a ligament is a band of dense, regular connective tissue that attaches a bone to a bone. So ligaments are giving you some structural support. Here's a ligament here. There's no muscle here, so a ligament can't cause movement, right? It's just giving you some structural support of that joint. So that joint cartilage or articular cartilage, this is kind of a representation of a knee joint with the knee bent like this. So we're looking head on at the end of the femur that has these two kind of like knuckles on the end of it, like that. And you can see the cartilage on the top of your shin bone or tibia as well. And what they're showing here is a patch of cartilage that's been worn away. So if that cartilage wears away or is damaged or inflamed, right, and you lose it, then you have bone on bone. Bone is not smooth and slippery at all, right? And this is what arthritis is. So here is a knee joint, for example. This is a healthy knee. And you see all this black in between the two bones in the knee joint. That's because there is cartilage there. This image over on the right, bone on bone. So if you've ever heard somebody, maybe a grandparent say, oh, my arthritis is so bad, the doctor says it's just bone on bone. They're right. right? So if you lose that cartilage, then it's just bone on bone, and there's a lot of friction, and there's pain, and it doesn't move well, and it hurts.
I know cartilage doesn't grow back, but can it just be replaced without having to do like a whole knee replacement?
So cartilage in general, once it's gone, it doesn't grow back. Is there something that you can do aside from a total knee replacement, right? Can you do like a cartilage transplant or something like that? They haven't yet figured out anything like that. Sometimes what they'll do is inject some viscous fluid into the joint itself to act kind of like synovial fluid to kind of, but even more viscous stuff to help. But usually once it's this bad, then they go for a total joint replacement, where we basically put in a mechanical joint, this all metal here and all metal there. Right? Replace the ends of the bones. I should have put a picture of that in there, but I didn't. All right, so joints allow us to move. And so I'm going to end today with just talking about the different types of movement, because then on Thursday we're going to do muscles, which are what cause the movement. So the first thing that I want to drill into your heads is that it's all about what's happening of the angle of the bones. So a straight line, you'll remember from geometry, if my elbow is my fulcrum, this is an angle of 180 degrees, right? This is 90, so I've decreased the angle. This is 45, okay? So this is called flexion. If you are decreasing the angle, it is called flexion. So for my knee, right, this is 180 degrees. This is flexion, bending it in. So most of the time, flexion is bending. There are some joints where it's a little bit kind of harder to figure out, and so we'll talk about that in a second. But I want to stress that when I do the opposite movement, when I open up the angle, that is extension. So you have to be really careful when we talk about muscles, because in lay terminology, if a muscle is activated, people say it's flexing. But in anatomy, it could be flexing or it could be extending, depending on which muscle it is and how it acts across the joint. So for example, this is my biceps. If I contract my biceps, it flexes my elbow. If I contract or activate my triceps muscle, it extends my elbow. So it is incorrect in a biology or anatomy class to say that the triceps muscle flexes, because it never causes that action to occur. It never causes flexion. The triceps is the extender or extensor. It only causes extension at the elbow. So I just wanted to kind of like put that in your heads, because it's one of those things where like regular everyday language bumps up against science language and they mean different things. So just be really careful. Sometimes that can trip you up on some questions. All right, we'll stop there. Have a great day, everybody. Stay safe. I'll see you Thursday. We'll talk about muscles.